All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
Why on earth would a razor company want to market a female-centric political ideology to men? HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Feminists would like you to believe that they're all strong, independent women who don't need men. Gloria Steinem famously summed up the public face of that attitude by saying, "A woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle." The message is clear. Men shouldn't expect any gratitude or civility from feminists because feminists consider them to be extraneous, maybe redundant. And that is why feminists spend so much time telling non-feminist women all of the things they think we wouldn't have if they hadn't fought for them. They demonize men as oppressors by attributing everything objectionable in society to patriarchy, the feminist word for a system wherein positions of administrative responsibility are filled mostly or entirely by men. They describe this system as one in which men have power and women are largely excluded from it. We're told that before feminism, women had no power because women couldn't vote, couldn't hold political office, and couldn't have control of business enterprises or finances, including their own. None of that is true, but let's entertain those claims for a moment. In a system in which, through placement in positions of administrative responsibility, men have power, and through absence from those positions, women are largely excluded from it, how could women's political agitation be responsible for any change in women's situation? Who did the movement turn to in order to achieve the social evolution for which feminists take credit? Why, that would be the so-called patriarchy, dear. From the days of the suffragettes, whose activism was funded by women spending their husbands' income on suffragette merchandise, who appealed to male legislators to change the law to include women in the franchise, who were able to apply significant social pressure on those legislators, feminists have relied on the very system they now claim to oppose. Even before women had the vote, they were appealing to that so-called patriarchy for social and legal changes. American feminists brag about their role in bringing about the 19th Amendment, but rarely, if ever, take credit for women's role in bringing about the 18th Amendment, ratified on January 29, 1919. This ushered in the era of alcohol prohibition, during which the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors, previously a norm in American life, was illegal. Even before that, women's activism produced effective results with the so-called patriarchy. Dorothea Dix began campaigning for prison and mental hospital reform in 1841. Her activism changed the manner in which mentally ill women were housed, led to improved conditions in mental hospitals, and brought women into the role of medical service in the military during the Civil War. She never got involved with the feminist movement, but her activism was mainly on behalf of women, and modern feminists cite her as an example of an early feminist activist. The tender years doctrine, the standard by which custody assignment in divorce cases is informed in legal systems that are based on English common law, came about as a result of the activism of UK feminist Carolyn Norton. Her activism was a result of the same parental alienation that is visited upon many a father today by many a resentful or even simply inconsiderate ex-wife. Women have no difficulty recognizing that denial of family relationships is abuse when it is done to them. Norton wrote the bill which would become the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, followed by her plain letter to the Lord Chancellor regarding the bill, in an effort to ensure that it would be adopted. This was a direct appeal to men in political power, the backbone of feminism's supposed patriarchy, to legally deem mothers more important than fathers to their young children's development, health, and welfare. One might argue that, of course, before suffrage, women had only the patriarchy to appeal to in order to achieve any form of social and legal change, and feminists might try to claim their activism changed that, but they'd be wrong. Even modern feminists do not accomplish anything that cannot be attributed to funding from, or appeals to, their movement's boogeyman. Second-wave feminists lobbied governing bodies and corporate interests, the very seats of administrative responsibility they cite in their description of what patriarchy means, for changes in law and policy on the basis of feminist interests. We've gone over some of those changes in the past, including intimate partner and sexual violence laws that infringe on men's due process rights for women's purported benefit, and the mess that is Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. It was also during the 70s that feminists began directly lobbying Congress to change the federal government's approach to domestic violence. During hearings before the House Subcommittee on Select Education, representatives from numerous women's organizations gave testimony promoting feminist theories on prevalence and gender dynamics of family violence, striving to convince legislators to gender the law. At first, it didn't work, resulting eventually in the Gender-Neutral Family Violence Prevention and Services Act of 1984. But continued agitation by feminists convinced Congress in the 90s to make more changes, resulting in the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. Last week, we went over the feminist advocacy research scam in which these ideologues use a house of cards system to disguise propaganda drawn from academic fraud and deliberately biased research as factual information on which legislative and policy standards should be based. The question is, how have they been able to achieve that scam when academic endeavors require funding? How did feminism even get a foothold in academia, another aspect of the system they call patriarchy? Why, patriarchal money, of course. Ever wonder where women's studies as an academic area originated? So did Capital Research Center's Kimberly Schuld, and she tracked that information down. In an article published in Front Page magazine, she wrote, Women's Studies professor and feminist author Susan M. Hartman credits the Ford Foundation with being a substantive force that created the feminist movement. In fact, Ford's support of women's studies and feminist causes is so extensive that it cannot be summarized in an article of this length. The subject is ripe for a full-length book. It is safe to say that without the Ford Foundation, feminism would not have been successful in gaining such a strong foothold in academia, and by extension, politics. The program, conceived in 1970 after a handful of women's studies courses cropped up in several universities, was funded by the Ford Foundation in 1972, the same year as Title IX took effect. That $1 million national fellowship program for faculty and doctoral dissertation research on the role of women in society and women's studies broadly construed helped significantly to promote the area of study. Within a decade, there were over 100 such programs in schools all over the U.S., headed up and operated by feminist ideologues. Today, it's unusual for a university to not have such a department, now referred to as interdisciplinary studies. Remember, it was from within this academic area that the research standards which have so badly skewed public perception on intimate partner and sexual violence originated. Mary P. Koss, the creator of the survey method most researchers use to measure the scope and prevalence of these types of violence, was a women's studies professor at Kent State University in the 80s when she came up with that method. There is a direct line between massive funding by sources feminists would arguably call elements or agents of the patriarchy in any other discussion through feminism's academic presence to feminism's influence on law and policy. In Schuld's book, Capital Research Center's Guide to Feminist Organizations, she pointed out that groups like the National Organization for Women receive millions of dollars in major gifts, corporate and foundation grants and donations, legacies and bequests. Now's Legal Defense Fund, for instance, is the beneficiary of tens of thousands each from individual corporate donors, phone companies, credit card companies and banks, investment companies, you name it. Among those funding the organization is Condé Nast Publications, the company that bought Reddit.com in 2006 and maintained ownership until 2011. It was during that time that feminists pretty much took over that site. The Feminist Majority Foundation has received hundreds of thousands from government grants and private donors, including Soros Foundation donations totaling $375,000 between 1997 and 2001 for the promotion of abortion clinics and the morning after pill. The guide lists numerous women's organizations receiving similar funding, most of which have donors and stated goals in common. Then there are the multitude of government grants for organizations serving what feminist groups have convinced legislators are women's interests, making millions of dollars available to those who can convince the funding's gatekeepers that they meet the requirements. Among the laws creating such funding is the Violence Against Women Act, which created formula grants that pay for a variety of services, including representatives to accompany women who have made domestic violence allegations when they go to court. Between the hundreds of programs in existence, if you want to work for a feminist cause or to use the label research to camouflage the creation of feminist propaganda, there are millions of dollars in funding to be pulled from Uncle Sam's deep pockets. And where does Uncle Sam get his money? Mostly men, actually. Men pay 200% of the taxes that women initially pay, and in most age groups, women get back more from the government than they have paid in, meaning that the vast majority of net tax collection comes from men. Men fund the government. Women, especially feminist women, benefit from it. A federal budget that runs in the trillions of dollars. Ladies, that's an awfully expensive bicycle. Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 68. But Muh Patriarchy. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with She Who Must Be Obeyed, Karen Strawn, that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, and nonsense annihilator, Lauren B., to have a little discussion about feminism's boogeyman on a leash. But first, a message from the non-fictional side of the internet. YouTube's glitches are getting weirder, guys. We just saw that on Tuesday. Subscribers not notified, streams dropped, feminists falling out of the sky. If you want to keep up with what we're doing, you need notifications from badgerfeed.com. Register, receive notifications, be happy. If you want to support what we do, even in the midst of all of the financial blacklisting that is taking place today, feedthebadger.com is the site for that. With Patreon hemorrhaging users, and the demonstration, or the demonetization fairy stalking Google Ads users, Feed the Badger is the most stable way to support our work. So remember, Badger Feed for information, and Feed the Badger to support our work. Because we're just confusing like that. And last thing, if you want the opportunity to nag everyone else into checking us out, don't forget to smash that like button and share us on every social media site you use. Unless, of course, the patriarchy stops you. But as Karen pointed out to me yesterday, that's not really what feminists are talking about. Are you there, Karen? Oh, I can't hear.
It's silent.
I can't hear Karen. Is it? This is the technical difficulties show. Welcoming, apparently Prim can talk, and Karen can't.
Oh, no.
She's the one that I wanted to start out with, too, because she had a really good point. We'll see if she can come back in and tell us all about it. But in the meantime, anybody else have anything?
Well, I mean, I guess there's just the whole point about how, it's kind of senseless to talk about the pay gap incessantly and not take into account all the factors. So, if women are largely tax negative, then, maybe the whole pay gap thing that has already been debunked anyway, but, maybe the whole pay gap thing kind of sorts itself out.
Yeah, there is that. That's something that people don't talk about very much either. A large portion of the U.S.
Can you guys?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes.
Oh, yay!
I'll finish my sentence real quick. A large portion of the
right.
U.S. federal government budget exists for the benefit of women, not just in terms of money they give to women, but money they pay people to do things for women. Karen.
Well, okay. When I was when Discord decided to fart in my mouth, I was about to say, let's call it what it is. It's Dad.
Yeah, it is. Daddy government.
It's Dad. We don't have a nanny state. We have a daddy state. Well, we do have a nanny state. We have a nanny state that's like, no, 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 you can't do this, you can't do that. And we have a daddy state who's like, of course, honey, you can have money for this. So yeah, no, it's paternalism is what it is. And like one of the things that drives me crazy about the current cultural discourse is we have this idea that it was men all along, those horrible, awful men in power preventing women from getting the vote. Like by 1885, Millicent Fawcett and other suffragettes were willing to concede that they had a majority of support in Parliament. The only reason why Parliament kept refusing to pass women's suffrage bills is because the Labour and Democratic parties in the UK, the parties of working class people, and there was not a large voting constituency of working class people, but these were the parties who were representing these people who had just in 1865, gotten the vote when certain property restrictions were loosened. They knew it would be political suicide because all of these bills were essentially just let rich white women have the vote. So rich white women vote mostly the same way as rich white men. They would have voted conservative, and the parties representing the working class would have been annihilated, because you'd be doubling the votes of people who vote against working class interests. I mean, like I'm absolutely flabbergasted by the fact that I never learned about that in school. I never learned about all kinds of things in school. I just learned that men were horrible all the way through, and women, they fought, and at least one of them died, securing the vote for women. That would be Emily Davison, by the way.
Oh yes, that's right. And actually,
in that publicity stunt gone wrong, where she could have killed multiple people.
Yeah, I was going to say she put other people at risk for what she wanted as well. This is something that people don't know today about the suffragette movement either. They were violent. They were inconsiderate of all of the people around them. They were not fighting for poor women's right to vote. They were just fighting for wealthy women's right to vote. But many of the suffragettes didn't know that, so they got poor women involved in the suffragette movement. They were not reasonable or rational, and they chose to have their own separate, special, just them suffragette movement, in addition to, or on the side of, or in competition with an existing suffrage movement that went back a couple of centuries. So the suffragettes were selfish pigs, honestly. And that's on both sides of the pond. There were movements to bring about a universal vote on both sides of the pond, and on both sides of the pond there were privileged, wealthy, or upper class white women who wanted to get their voting rights without any of the grubby underclasses getting theirs, if it were. And so whenever I hear feminists say, if it wasn't for feminism, you wouldn't have the right to vote, my answer is no. If it wasn't for men, I wouldn't have the right to vote. If feminists had their way, I wouldn't have the right to vote. I'm not upper class. I'm one of the grubby underclasses. I'm not good enough for feminists.
Yeah, no, and one of the things too that is forgotten in the mists of history is that the primary slogan that brought about the Representation of the People Act, which was what enacted women's suffrage in the UK. Dog shush. The slogan that was most used, that was on the tip of everybody's tongue except these goddamn dogs. I'm sporting you.
Karen's being silenced by the patriarchy.
Oh my god.
Oh god. The puns. Anyway, but the Representation of the People Act, the slogan was, if they're fit to fight, they're fit to vote. It was about bringing those last 5 million or so working class men into the franchise after World War I, after millions had died, right? Millions of men had died. Oh my
That
god.
dog.
Kevin, just like a girl. Just like a girl. You always just gotta interrupt. You're femterrupting. Stop it. I'm gonna squirt you until you're
Go eat a
good
can
and
in the
sorry.
kitchen.
It's really bad too, because we were talking about it so serious. This is something that feminists deny all the time. Oh no, men didn't have to go to war to get the right to vote. Yes, they did. Actually.
Yes, they did. And you know, like men didn't have to go to war to get their right to vote in the US, except for the fact that was decided retroactively by SCOTUS.
Some did.
It was retroactively by SCOTUS in 1917. It was decided that all citizens with the rights of citizens have a reciprocal obligation to the government, which includes the draft. And then 2 years later, they gave women the vote.
Yeah, only they didn't have. It wasn't a universal vote. I mean, there were men in the U.S. that couldn't vote. So you had. In 1876, the Supreme Court had ruled that Indians weren't citizens. Native American Indians. Of course, they didn't use the term back then. It was Indian. It was not Native American. Then in 1890, they were told they could apply. They could apply for the right to become naturalized citizens in their own ancestral land. Okay. This is generations of people grew up in this land, and it gets taken over, and now you can apply to become a citizen because that's the way it was.
Okay.
Now there's more. There's more. Okay.
But that's more complicated than
There's
more.
It's
made out to be as well. So.
They didn't have to let them. So they could apply, but they didn't have to let them. They had to meet all the same conditions as an immigrant, if I understand correctly. Then in 1882, there was the Chinese exception. Laws denying citizenship to various Asian immigrants had passed in 82 and 1922. Japanese immigrants were also denied. In 1919, Native Americans in 1925, Filipinos were told, respectively, that they could earn their citizenship and their voting rights by going to war. And then now, those are not the only ones. Recently, it was proposed, I think the Republicans are the ones that proposed it too, but recently it was proposed, it's been proposed in 3 different administrations. I think the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration, that we make enlistment in the military a stipulation for amnesty that's being talked about for illegal immigrants who have not broken any other laws after illegally immigrating into the United States. So this idea, and this is something that's to be expected of men. Now maybe the modern time, if they actually do this, they'll make the same stipulation with women. But it was men that they did this to before. They didn't expect women to join the military. They didn't expect women to go to World War I and World War II. They only expected men to do that. So that was the way that worked. So there's a lot of complexity in the you didn't have to go to war to get your vote narrative, because not only was it the case originally, and not only did there have to be a law to say, well, this isn't going to be this way anymore, it didn't apply to everybody. And then on top of that, if you're a guy, you turn 18 in the United States, you have to sign up for selective service. If you get to the age of 26 and you still haven't done it, you can't. and you are now locked into a felony. And this is like, you have to have a really good reason why you couldn't. If you were in a coma for that whole time, you aren't guilty of a felony. But if you just didn't sign up for selective service, it's a felony, and your voting rights can be taken away for felony crimes in most states. You don't get to vote. So when feminists say that, they're actually talking about a very narrow condition of, there is no law that says you have to sign up to be drafted in order to have the right to vote. There is a law that says you can face penalties that can affect your right to vote if you don't.
Yeah, and there's also these days it's all automated. So if in fact, it's been automated for a long time. Somebody that we both know, who shall not be named, once told me that he had voted in several federal elections and had never registered for selective service. And so I was spreading misinformation, and then I said, "Are you sure about that? Go check." And then he went and he looked, and he said, "I checked the registry, and I was registered at age 18.
Yep, first time you vote.
First time you vote, first time you go to get your driver's license. There's small print all over the place. So it's anything you apply to the government for some kind of certification for, like just a state ID, a driver's license, vote registry, all of those things, you're going to be somewhere in the small print. It's going to say, by signing this document, you agree to be registered for selective service.
Yeah, now there's another aspect in the United States that it's basically what happened in the UK during World War I. I believe it was World War I. The draft during the Vietnam War. When the Vietnam War started, the voting age was 21. When the Vietnam War ended, the voting age was 18. And that was because of the draft. Men could be drafted at 18 years old, but they couldn't vote. And it was pointed out that was incredibly wrong, right?
How embarrassing! All these young men coming home with their limbs blown off or in body bags, and none of them had the right to vote on whether they wanted a war hawk in government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they lowered the voting age for women too.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Of course they would.
And again, women don't get drafted. So and the discussions over women getting drafted, when people talk about drafting girls and making girls apply to the draft, I hear all kinds of discussion about whether or not it's going to be good for women. I have only ever gotten a few people to discuss with me whether or not it's going to be good for the men who are already in the military, and whether women will be reliable enough to have the right to fight alongside of those men. And, it's possible that they could be. It's quite possible that they could be. But those men have the right to question that, in my mind.
Well, I hear a lot of, I do hear a lot of, the argument that, we can't send our daughters to war is so fucking bullshit, right? It's not like we're going to take all the Private Benjamins and send them into foxholes and all the freaking Navy SEALs and send them to cook fucking waffles in barracks.
Yeah, no.
Right? Okay, we're not going to do that. That's not going to happen, right? There's plenty of roles that women can, that they are capable of fulfilling in the military. But then you also have to ask yourself, right? What does it do to the cohesion of the existing military to introduce women into the mix? And I don't think that's been studied near enough. I think that the movie Private Benjamin took a fairly glaring look at it. And oddly enough, the conclusion of the film was the senator saying, men, people in government just Americans aren't willing to send their daughters off to war. And that's why you're not going to get, to be in combat, when the actual reason that her commanding officer put in front of her was that you fuck with the men. Your presence, your mere presence, no matter how good you are, right? No matter how awesome you are, you could be better at the job than every single one of them, but your mere presence fucks with the men, right? We have not explored this properly. We have not looked into this. The Israeli military has put in measures to deal with what they found after they had integrated units, and they've said, okay, well, we're going to have male only and female only units. But we also have to look at, okay, so if we had a draft, right, or if we had conscription, okay, so do the women get all the cushy jobs and the men get all the fucking nasty, dirty, dangerous ones? Isn't that like just a repeat of the same shit? Same shit, different day?
Yep.
Basically. And you know what? Furthermore, like we talk about what are they going to do to the units? Of course they're going to distract them, because a lot of people will jump out of the way to protect the woman in the unit. And you know what the most annoying thing about that is that they would probably use that as an excuse to say, oh, well, that's because the patriarchy, because they don't believe that women can actually do the job, so they're just going to defend the women, of course.
Yeah.
Well, what I think is worse, the worst thing about that is they'll say sexual thing and they want to get in the woman's pants and blah blah blah.
That's true.
And
too.
it's like, no, you know, like there is a fucking thing called instinct, right? I'm sorry, there just is. Right? and if you actually take that, extrapolate it all the way down to the bottom of the fucking rabbit hole, and if you are willing to say, well, the men in these units, in these integrated units, would protect women, right? And that, you know, they would protect women at the expense of their own lives or at the expense of the mission, they would do that. Okay, if you're willing to say that, and you're willing to say, and it might be something that's just innate, might be something that's just a part of what men are intrinsically, right? How the fuck can you support an idea that men have essentially enslaved women all through history?
Yeah.
The men are instinctively compelled to give up their lives and their safety to protect women, but at the same time, they were all oppressors who oppressed women and put them in a state of slavery and subjugation.
It makes
by
no sense.
protecting them, it's oppression, don't you see?
It's completely
that's the way this
self-contradictory. It's completely self-contradictory, unless they want to accuse men of a giant case of Munchausen's by proxy. But that would, in the case of feminists, that would be projection, because they do the same thing. If you think about it, the people who have spent the most effort and time breaking down and taking away the society's perception of women's personal agency to do things of their own volition and to be competent to make their own decisions and all of that, that's feminists. It's not patriarchy out there. And honestly, part of the reason that men in America today have such a rough time viewing women fighting in foxholes is because women can't even handle being asked permission to do something by somebody who is famous. You know, they're so incapable of making their own decisions and standing their own ground that they can't look at Louis C.K. and say, no, I don't want to watch you do that. Then what the fuck are they fighting to get into a foxhole for?
I know. I'm looking at this Gillette ad, right? Okay, and I'm looking at it from a number of different angles, and I haven't put out a video about it yet. I haven't really said much. I've commented under other people's videos about it, but I haven't really, I'm still formulating my thoughts. But one of the things that really got me is, you know, there are essentially two women. Oh wait, four women in the ad, right? Mm-hmm. 4 women who actually do anything that interact in some way with the men, right? Or the boys. Right. One is a mother who's hugging a fat single mother who's hugging her son, while a bunch of freaking neighborhood boys burst into her house and run through her living room, which is, I've lived in some pretty freaking nasty neighborhoods, and that's never happened to me. I've never had boys just barge into my house and run through it and overturn tables because they really wanted to beat up some kid. But she doesn't do anything. She's just holding. Stop. God. Stop. Both of you. You egg each other on. Anyway, so she's just sitting there completely inert. She doesn't say, "What the fuck are you doing in my living room, you little shits?" Right? She doesn't pick up the nearest blunt object and brandish it at them and say, "Get the fuck out of my house. What is wrong with you?" She doesn't do nothing. Okay? The other one, right, is this woman who's like sitting in a boardroom and the head boss is mansplaining to her and she just looks crestfallen and dejected. And it's like, if you're gonna tolerate that shit, that kind of condescending crap, you don't belong in a fucking boardroom. I don't care whether you're a man or whether you're a woman. You do not belong there. I'm sorry. Like, what the fuck? Are you what are you, a piece of soggy fucking... You're a piece of half-done French toast. That's what you are.
They act
uncooked
like...
egg in the middle. When you try and pick it up, it falls apart. And then...
They act like nobody ever does that to men.
I know.
That's not true.
And then,
people do that to men all the time.
The girls in bikinis who are like, "Oh, I don't like you because you told me to smile. But... we can't even actually summon up enough agency to, like, go over someplace else and talk to someone else. We actually have to just stand here helpless while you point your camera at us and tell us things until a very chivalrous man of color comes and tells you that that's not okay." Right?
Not cool, bro.
And I'm just like, are you fucking kidding me? And I'm not even going to criticize the woman walking down the street because, for all I know, if the black man hadn't stopped the white man with the not cool bro thing and let the white man go after her and ask for her number or say, "Those are some awesome freaking shorts" or something, I don't fucking know, right? But for all I know, that particular woman, right, who didn't even notice any of these guys, would have been like, "Hey, you're pretty hot," right? Okay, so there was no interaction there. But, okay, you have to actually, as a man, you have to actually prevent other men from interacting with women, period.
Of course. I had a discussion with somebody about this video. Basically, they had posted a thing. It's like, "Oh, I'm so glad that these advertising companies are now saying, 'Fuck the MRAs. We don't even care about your dollars.'" I'm like, yeah, I'm sure that's exactly what it was. But then they said, well, it's like they're just getting mad because all these commercials are doing is telling men to be better, and what's the problem with that? It's like, well, okay, first of all, they're saying that men ought to be better than these absurd straw men that they're constructing, saying, yeah, all men are horrible and do terrible things, so just be better than that. Like, I mean, really, a row of men standing in front of their grills saying, "Boys
not all. Hashtag not all." Too few men are not like that, but it's not all men. It's just the vast majority. I mean, come on.
Of course, my bad, right? But yeah, so it's like, on top of that, maybe it's just that people are really freaking sick and tired of these companies trying to tell men what they should and shouldn't do, whether it's accurate or not. Like, I think that these guys just need to take a step back and be like, hey, maybe I shouldn't be telling people how to behave all the time, or maybe my view of things is not the way that everybody else views things, and I should stop expecting people to share my exact viewpoint. 900,000 dislikes as last I looked. I think it was at 915 downvotes. It's like, okay, maybe it's not just quote unquote the MRAs that have a problem with this stuff.
I just wonder how long it would take. I wonder how long it would take to get banned from Twitter If you created an account that did nothing but tell random women on Twitter not to put their babies in dumpsters.
Or not to commit paternity fraud, or
Right.
not to lie about birth control to trap a man into parenthood.
Now, don't file any false
rape
charges.
accusations.
Yeah, no false rape accusations, guys.
Not to alienate a father from his parents. Oh, and also don't be a queen bee, don't slut shame other women, and don't do the mean girl reputational annihilation form of bullying, right?
Yeah,
because and when you see women who are doing all of those things, it's your responsibility to call them out. Because, hey, your daughters are watching, right? No, when companies do ad campaigns for women, they do the a girl can or whatever it is, where it's like, you don't have to be ashamed of your body. You can go into the weight room. You can go into the gym. People aren't looking at you and judging you. You can actually go and do this, right? Absolutely positive, affirmational, and aspirational, right? Shows women who of various body types going in, exercising hard, sweating, not being ashamed of the fact that they jiggle, right? I think their slogan was "I jiggle, therefore I am," right? Or one of their hashtags, right? Okay, but that doesn't mean I can't exercise. That doesn't mean I can't be healthy. That doesn't mean I can't be the best me. Okay, so you have the Dove's campaign for real beauty, right? Which is women are beautiful in any size. Right, you have all of these campaigns.
Almost any size. They did not show a single woman who was thin.
Well, okay,
yeah,
okay, but they showed women. They showed a few women who had healthy body weights. Right, they weren't thin, but they actually had healthy body weights. They also didn't show anybody who was like so morbidly obese that her waist was twice the circumference of her hips.
Right, but they didn't. They showed women who were overweight, but they did not.
Yes.
They did not acknowledge the fact that women who are slightly underweight may be slightly underweight naturally.
There you go.
The reason that I noticed this is because that was something I got hit with when I was growing up with my super steroid enhanced metabolism. So yeah, they're mean about that.
Okay, so they left somebody out. They didn't, one thing that the Dove campaign for real beauty didn't do was put all of those women in their underpants and bras, right? Looking, and with their relatively decent waist to hip ratios, no matter what their weight was, right? So, which is a sign of health, like the waist to hip ratio is actually a sign of health and a proper hormone balance, right? So it's not necessarily that, you can have that waist to hip ratio at almost any weight if you have a proper hormone balance, which is why all the plus size models, including the really, really heavy ones, still have a waist to hip ratio where their waists are smaller than their hips. Right. But okay, let's get past that. Okay. Did the Dove campaign for real beauty show all of those women of varying weights from slightly above optimal to, maybe 180, 190, 210 pounds, okay? Show them pointing at a woman who was, I don't know, from that Beachbody Ready ad from Protein World or whatever it was, right? A woman who looks like that, pointing at her and telling her that she harms herself and others. Okay? That she harms herself and others and she needs to do better. Put on some pounds. Get with the program. Stop shaming other people by merely existing and allowing them to exist. Okay?
Oh,
yeah.
Stop doing harm, bitch. Right? No, they didn't. They didn't say you have a responsibility to all these fat women over here to make up for the fact that you exist in a certain way. No, they didn't do that. And one of the things that really got me was, I don't know how many of you remember this from your childhood, right? I mean, I was 19, 20 years old when that iconic Super Bowl ad by Gillette came out. Gillette, the best a man can get. It was a minute 30 or something, or a minute long, 1 minute long, and it contained 100% positive, aspirational messages about what men can be. They can succeed at the office. They can succeed at the racetrack. They can succeed on the soccer pitch. They can succeed parenting their sons, right? They can snuggle their newborn babies. They can get married. They can hug their male friends and not even have to say no homo, right? Like they can be physically affectionate with their male friends and family members. All of these things, absolutely beautiful, positive affirmation of masculinity. And, you know, I'm sure there are many men out there who can't achieve what the guys in that commercial can achieve, right? They can't do the things that the guys in that commercial can do, okay? But those are all positive things about men, showing men in a positive light, real men, actual men, right? Including even a guy at the office whose male boss, right? He's on the phone, his male boss puts his hand on his shoulder and, you know, is like congratulating him. And then he's like, yes, right? Like touchy-feely stuff.
Yeah, they could have done that again. They really had. The material is out there. The situations exist. There are new things to talk about in terms of success. There are new jobs out there. There's new education out there. Everything. They could have done an updated version. And that was the point I made about that ad when I tweeted at him, was that you had the opportunity to do something great, and you wasted it on this ideological bullshit, this shaming
moral
tactic.
Scolding.
And the thing is, it's not just telling people be better. It's telling people you have to be better because you're bad.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, you know, I was just going to mention, Karen just brought up the "Are you beach body ready?" advertisement, and you know, it didn't matter when a bunch of women complained about that ad for being too sexy or whatever. You know, that's fine, that's expected, that's, oh, this is terrible because this is a sexualized woman. But when men complained about this Gillette ad, all of a sudden it's, oh, you're just being a whiny piss baby because you're just upset that people are telling you have to be better. Oh my gosh, maybe that's a sign that you should be better, whiny piss babies. And it's like, are you kidding me? What the hell?
Glug, male tears.
Yeah, exactly.
And but why don't men talk about their feelings? And I'm just like, and one of the things that really pissed me off about that Gillette ad, right, is that if you actually go back, and I went back and I looked at it, I looked at it 10 times, 10 freaking times, right? Okay, so you have the small blonde kid, right? And he goes, "Rawr!" right? And claws at the other kid, right? Okay, the ginger kid. Okay, who's bigger, and then they tumble in the grass and they're wrestling, and this bigger ginger kid is being pro-social. He's letting the smaller kid win, right? Because if you let the smaller kid win at least some of the time, right, then the smaller kid's gonna want to do rough and tumble play with you again, right? And when you look at the actual research on rough and tumble play, right? And neither of them look like they're not enjoying themselves. This is the thing. So either they're bad actors, these kids, bad child actors who don't know how to act, like they're not enjoying themselves, or they're actually enjoying themselves. And we have to break that up, because that's not the way you treat people. When in reality, that kind of play, particularly when it's unsupervised or unobserved by spectators, is one of the key factors in the ability of boys to develop empathy, to develop self-control, to develop self-correction, to learn their own boundaries and the boundaries of others, between kids of different sizes and ages and skill sets, to learn how to accommodate those kids who have they're smaller, they're less strong, they have weaker skills. All of those things, you let them do it, because it actually is one of the primary contributors to them being able to develop healthy empathy, to develop a sense of fair play, and to develop a sense of being generous to those who are weaker than them. That's what you do. You let them do that. You don't tell them that's not how we treat each other.
This is something that feminists don't understand, but it's something a lot of women don't understand in general. And it's one of the reasons why boys who are raised by single moms end up with certain types of dysfunction in adulthood, because there is not a dad there or a male mentor there telling her, you know, hey, let him take his lumps, let him interact with the other guys, let him learn the social order, let him learn how to deal with these things, let him learn how to be the big guy that lets the little guy wail on him a little bit so the little guy learns, and
Exactly.
let him learn from his actions and let him learn from their actions. Because a lot of women, we have a tendency to be overprotective. We have a tendency to want to wrap all our kids in bubbles and not let anything happen to them and not let anybody get too close to them and not let anybody, you know, be mean to them or anything like that. And because it's the aspect of you that it hurts to see your kids get hurt is bigger than the aspect of you that is able to analyze, what is my kid getting from this? What benefit can my child get from this experience? So you have to have that balance.
Like, and also from a different perspective too, like you know, there's the perspective of the mother, of course, too, but there's also the fact that, like, in childhood, these children, they interact differently socially with each other than they do in a co-ed manner, right? Like, even the boys who don't necessarily turn to rough and tumble play, even the boys who prefer to interact in more quiet ways, they're still interacting in different ways than girls would with each other, right? So even if a boy is not into rough and tumble play, he's still going to be very different. So just coming at this from a female lens, you're still not going to get that understanding that boys have a different way of being than girls do. So having that father around to kind of explain that, or to provide that kind of different role model, is still going to be critical, whether they're a hockey player or whether they're, you know, a little scientist or a bookworm or something like that. They're still going to be very different from girls who have all those tendencies too, right?
Very much so. You know, even, I guess a good way for me to describe it, and I suppose this is story time, but when I was growing up, we had around, our house was on a hill. And so around the bottom of the hill where it sort of met the sidewalk, there had to be a bit of a wall to keep erosion from putting dirt on the sidewalk and off of our property and everything, right? So the owner of the house prior to us had used limestone, and there were these great big limestone slabs stacked, and in between these great big limestone slabs were these fabulous little caverns, you know, so it looked like the side of a mountain with little caves and everything in it. And you know, the girls in the neighborhood basically would just kind of enjoy that. The boys took their action figures and scaled the cliffs and everything. And you had to be careful too, because those little caverns were the perfect location for fisher spiders to build their...
Oh dear.
Yeah. So that you get this web, and it's a funnel web. It's usually about maybe... It goes over the edge of the front of the stones. And then in the center of it is that little tornado-looking funnel that the spider hides in. And so, of course, now the thing to watch for differences, gender differences, is when the girls and the boys are playing together, which I used to play with the boys all the time. I had my own little action figures and everything. I had glamour dolls, and they were not the same as the real action figures, but they were the same height. So, you know, we could put them on parachutes and stuff too. And then I had Princess Leia, and then, you know, a few other things like that. But we'd be doing this, and there's a significant difference between the way the boys would react and the way the girls would react upon finding a spider. The girls would scream and run, when they found a spider. The boys wanted to see what the spider would do. So, then the spider ends up with a bunch of debris in its web, which isn't nice to the spider. Or if they can catch a ant or a fly or something, the spider ends up with dinner.
Exactly.
And it's fascinating. It's just absolutely fascinating to watch the spider feed. But what's really interesting is watching the boys react if the spider rejects their sacrifice. So I mean, like, the girls, girls would take something like that personally. The boys figured out, the spider doesn't get all that excited about little bitty ants. So we got to feed it something bigger. And that was like kind of the way the brains work differently at 8 years old. They work differently enough that when you run into something that, if this bites me, it's going to suck because it's going to itch for like a week. Girls will scream and run away from it. Boys want to find out what it'll do, and they will poke and prod and play and, stuff like that. And so it was a lot more fun to hang out with the boys because of that. I will say that.
It was more scientific to see.
Yeah.
I had the exact same scenario. Like at my house, there was this spider hole, and the guy friends were all like, "Let's get some bugs and toss it and see if it'll pop itself out."
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I was yicked out by the spider, but I didn't have to get close to it. I could still watch it because it's like, okay, I'm also curious to see if it'll pop out. Actually.
Well, and then I was the real oddball because I didn't react the way the other girls reacted. I didn't quite react the way the boys reacted either. But we used to have this great series of photographs that I took of the boys in my neighborhood playing with a spider in the stones. Because that was, this is really cool. Look what they're doing. Look, the spider's coming out. Oh, I got to get pictures. That's always been me. And I got up close pictures of the spider. I wasn't, terribly afraid to get up close to the spider. As long as it didn't, when they draw their legs in, this isn't the jumping kind, but when they draw their legs in so they make themselves a little taller and then they start crouching down, you don't want to be within jumping distance. But, because I discovered that by accident too. That's when I turn into a girl and scream and run, when the spider jumps at me, at my camera.
God.
At my camera too, like
yeah, that would be me too.
Yeah. So and the to bring this back to the whole patriarchy thing though, how can feminists understand the motivations of male society if they cannot even understand that during childhood the way we experience and investigate and react to the world develops differently between the sexes?
Yeah, exactly. Well, like it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that people are different from each other.
Exactly.
Well, what I've always said, because people point to the upper, 0.1% of men, or of people, right? And say, well, they're almost all men, right? And that means it's patriarchy. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, okay, maybe you could make an argument that it is a society that results in dominance by males at the upper echelons, right? Okay, but please prove to me that the men in power, the men in that top 0.1%, actually oppress women for the benefit of all other men. Please demonstrate that to me, because that has never been demonstrated to me. And all that your dogma is telling me, okay, you as feminists, all that your doctrine about this patriarchy theory that a society is male dominated and that male domination, male dominance exists to privilege all men at the expense of all women, and at the expense of their oppression and subordination, right? Okay. All that tells me is that if you were in fucking charge, you would be oppressing the opposite sex for the benefit of your own. Because that's the way your mind is working. It's not the way the minds of the men at the top are working, right?
Yeah,
but that's the way your mind works. And so why would I fucking trust you to have any power at all?
Well, no kidding. Like there's no way that like 99% of the CEOs out there, I'm sure, are thinking, oh boy, I sure did step on a lot of women's backs to get to where I am. This is great being up here.
Yeah, this is something that when I hear this from feminists, I hear about the men at the top, I hear about the CEOs, I hear about the politicians and everything. There's a couple of things I think of. First of all, the point that Karen made about, obviously that's the way you think because it's where your head went. I had to say that to somebody yesterday. One of my friends on Twitter made a point about the fact that the way we are today and the way we interact with each other today, the way our mating habits are as a species are today, that's a result of natural evolution. And one should not think that evolution stops, it's just from the neck down, and from the neck up it never happened, and so there won't be differences between groups of people that experienced different conditions depending on where they evolved and what hardships they faced and so on, what cultures they developed and everything. Like that's the development of culture. This feminist immediately went to eugenics with it. You're advocating eugenics. He didn't say anything about it being mandatory. He didn't say anything about it being something the government should force. He didn't even say anything about one group being better than another. But, that's where the feminist took it immediately. Eugenics. And I'm sitting here thinking,
Margaret Sanger had her roots in eugenics. She founded Planned Parenthood in order to stop the darkies from reproducing like weeds.
That's pretty much what she said, too. But my point is, the guy would not have thought of that. This was a feminist man. You know what I think of feminist men already. But this was a feminist man. He would not have thought of that if that was not already in his head. If those attitudes were not already within him. And, like, the person he said it to... is Canada has a different name for, like, they don't call what Indians Native Americans like the United States indigenous. He was okay. Yeah. So his ancestors were subjected to eugenics under law in Canada, and so his genetic makeup is a result of that. And of course he's appalled by the idea, and here is this white feminist guy accusing him of promoting it by pointing out that evolution happens and that the development of the mind and the development of culture are not exempt or excluded from that. That is the ultimate in projection. You've got to be kidding me. And that's the discussion that we've been having for the last couple of days on YouTube. On Twitter. It's part of the reason why I chose patriarchy as the topic, or rather the feminist exploitation of patriarchy, because it just blows my mind. The answer for everything is patriarchy. Does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight? Yes, patriarchy.
Patriarchy did this.
The patriarchy did this. Did you stick a stick in your front tire of your bicycle and then have an accident? Patriarchy.
Okay, let's just pretend that we are Mary Daly and Sally Miller Gerhardt's love child. Okay, even though they're both women.
I'm traumatized now.
Apparently, you can create sperm out of female cells, right? So men will soon be completely unnecessary to the feminist utopia. But okay, so let's pretend we're the love child of Mary Daly and Sally Miller Gerhardt, and we have reduced men to 10% of the population. Well, due to their scarcity, their rarity, the laws of supply and demand, each of those men would be essentially sequestered in a comfortable environment, getting handies right and left. Okay. And that would be hand jobs. And and just being fed, just being allowed to just exist. And women who wanted some kind of interaction with a man would have to line up at the door to get access to him. They would have to maybe pay. And these men would therefore have all the power. They would have all the power.
We can't get away from the patriarchy.
Never.
It will always have power, no matter what.
It's the best. It's the best thing. This boogeyman is like the best campfire story ever written, because if you just add enough special pleading, there is no end. There's never going to be an end to it. Anytime there's any situation in which women do not have what feminists would call the upper hand. Sorry, I was looking at the chat and I saw Karen scaring me. I'm like, what? What feminists would call the upper hand, and what feminists call the upper hand isn't necessarily always the upper hand, by the way. Being sent into combat in war is not having the upper hand, and yet there are feminists who actually treat being exempt from that as a form of oppression. Like
not being allowed, but not being forced.
Right.
Yeah. Is
oppression somehow. But yeah, anytime feminists could say women don't have the upper hand, they would call it a patriarchy. They would say women are oppressed. They would say we need to fix this. They would say we need to artificially change what people are doing, whether they want us to or not, whether women want to or not, whether men can or not, whether it's going to be good for the people involved or not, whether it's going to be good for society or not. We need to change it because women don't have what we have defined as the upper hand. Therefore, fix it. It's broken.
I'd like to bring in something too, right? Because men are part of this problem as well, right? I mean, it was probably a bunch of men on a board of directors or whatever, right? Who approved the Gillette ad, right? There's male feminists galore. It's men who are heading up these tech companies that are bringing in the diversity and inclusion policies, and right. And it's men who gave women the vote. It's men who did all of this stuff. And it's also men who, okay, so I stumbled across this article a while ago on, I think it was the Telegraph, might have been the Daily Mail. I think it was the Telegraph, about how Victorian dads may have been the original new dads. Right? By new dad, you mean the progressive dad who changes diapers, who's like heavily involved with his kids and, is affectionate and all of these things, right? Anyway, some researcher who didn't get a whole lot of publicity, despite her startling findings, right? Because the Victorian dads actually have a historical reputation of being cold, distant, severe, harsh disciplinarians, largely absent from the home, right? And you go lower in the socioeconomic hierarchy, and the worse a reputation that Victorian dads have, right? But she actually looked at hundreds of diaries and autobiographies of people who grew up in the Victorian era. And what she found was that, and mostly working class people, what she found was that these people relayed accounts of their fathers as being affectionate, involved, interested in helping their children grow, achieve, learn about the world, wanted to spend time with their kids. Even when they were drunks, they were affectionate, kind, and loving to their children for the most part. Instances, first account instances of abuse were extremely rare in the literature that she examined, right? And oh my goodness, she actually even stumbled across one account of she actually said that the disciplinarian father seems to have been a fiction concocted by mothers to keep their kids in line. Just you wait till dad gets home. And she found evidence of this, including one account of a boy or a man who had grown up, who was recounting the incident that happened when he was a boy, of his mother demanding when his dad got home from work that he beat him, right? And his dad colluding with son, dad and son colluding, I'll whip the bedpost with my belt, you cry out, she'll think it's been done, and we'll both be off the hook here. Okay? Right? This is like, yeah. Okay, so, and she essentially said that, okay, one of the things that she thought was going on here with this bad reputation Victorian dads have is because that it was because that at the time there were innumerable upper middle, and upper class reformers and do-gooders who wanted to improve the working classes. And the best way that you can do that is to attack men.
So the Oprahs of their day.
And no, the Gillettes of their day.
Well,
and say, be better. And say, be better. Be better. Don't be abusive. Don't let your kids get away with stuff. Be involved. Show your sons how to be, right? Be a good father. Be a good mentor. Be a good example, right? All of those things, right? Social engineers in the upper strata of society wanting to essentially point the finger at the lower classes, right? To say that they are no good because their men are no good. And we're all familiar with this, right? Here in this little enclave that we have, this radio show that we have.
This is actually the message that you get from daytime talk shows for the most part.
Those men down there, right? Those men over there, or those men back then. And she said, so it was partly because of a desire of the upper and upper middle classes to reform the working class, to improve them, right? So you can't improve something that doesn't need improving on, so you have to portray them in a negative light. It was also part of a generational phenomenon where men say, those men back then, those were the bad men. But look at how far us men have come. We've progressed so far, right? And so we're the good men. And when I look at so much of what, like so much of the stuff that I've looked into over the last 10 years has been like that, right? Theodore Roosevelt, I'm one of the good men. I want to bring back the whipping post for men who beat their wives, right? Not even freaking realizing that, okay, if you want to bring it back for men who beat their wives, it actually was the punishment for men who beat their wives before the whipping post was banned, right? Okay, so there were other men back then, before you, who thought the same way. Blackstone, right? He got in a twofer. He said that when talking about the laws governing husbands and wives, right? He said that while some men of the lower classes may lay claim to their ancient right to physically discipline their wives, we enlightened men in the age of Charles II, right, are willing to guarantee women's security of the peace against their husbands. So those lower class men do what those men back then used to do. So he got in a twofer. He dissed the lower class men and the men of previous generations, right? And this just seems to be a phenomenon. It seems to be a way to virtue signal, and for men, to say, I'm a good man because look at all those horrible men over there. Look at all those horrible men back then, and look at all those horrible men down there.
Oh yeah, men are certainly not exempt from virtue signaling at all. Like the most recent men's mental health show that we did was basically talking about the very best man and how he looks down on all men and how we need to shout from the rooftops, hashtag I am sexist, or at least all men do. So yeah, no, men are very great at being virtue signalers when they want to be.
Yep, they just do it slightly differently from the way that that women do it. When women virtue signal, it's usually, look what good things I have done for this other person, and you better appreciate it, even if you didn't ask me to, and even if it's something that you didn't want, because I did it for you, so, you better appreciate it. They get into the Munchausen's kind of thing, and men who virtue signal seem to be more about demonizing all other men. I am the one good man. And I actually, from male feminists, I have gotten the "you better appreciate it" too, until I turn around and do the "you bought me dinner" analogy, and then they shut up. They don't like that. But I'm gonna hit the super chats because we've amassed a few, and it's been we're most of the way through the show, so I better get them read, or they're just gonna sit there. So we have the obligatory initial super chat. Master Rogue gives us $2 and says, "Prim!" Huggy face, heart, smiley face. Circuit de Flora gave us $10 and said, if Ignaz, I think that's Semmelweis, did not figure out that doctors who do not wash their hands after an autopsy and before assisting in a birth, I think he meant transmit germs, many more women would have died of infection. And that is true. Actually, feminists tried to blame male doctors blame male doctors for taking medicine backward a step by causing the spread of infection. What they don't realize is that if it hadn't been for male doctors doing autopsies, studying the dead after they died of diseases, and experimenting with new medical techniques, which is something that female, they weren't doctors, they were like the female caregivers that were what doctors were before there were doctors. They didn't change what they were doing. Once they learned one thing, you did that forever. That was always the treatment, and it wasn't, it wasn't going to evolve. And if it stopped working, the other person wasn't doing it right. But you have doctors come along and discover antibiotics, they discover surgery, they discover anesthetics, they discover antiseptics, they discover all these things, therapies and so on, that can help people in ways that previously, the wise women weren't wise enough to come up with. And the fact that that there was some messiness in that, that's going to happen as a society learns medication. But if people had listened to him when he figured that out in the first place, instead of treating him like a madman, it would have been much better. It wouldn't have been messy for as long. So, because people didn't listen to that man, a lot of people died. Hoki Bukisa gave us $4.99 and said, "It's been studied enough. It's detrimental to the performance of the unit." And that was in the discussion about women and mixed military service, mixed front lines and everything. And this is not to say that women can't fight, because they can. I mean, if my daughters had gone into the military, I would feel sorry for anybody who had to face them in combat. Really. But yeah, and I've heard that they can even be better at some things, flight combat and various other things like that. So yeah. Well, yeah, and men's and women's brains again develop differently throughout life. There are things that men are better at. There are things that women are better at in general. Sometimes there's exceptions, and that's normal. It's normal for there to be exceptions, not that the exceptions themselves are normal. But in any case, there's military. There are military forces that have women in them all over the world. I would not want to be on the wrong side of the women of the Kurdish military, for instance, for like 2 seconds, so there's, and I wouldn't even want to be on the wrong side of the women of the Israeli military for 2 seconds. Those women are tough. I don't know that American women could keep up with any of them. I certainly don't think American women are currently, as a group, maybe some individually, but definitely not as a group, as tough as any of those women. Those other women probably aren't coddled nearly as much as American. We haven't had to be. We're kind of spoiled, right? So it's not that women can't do these things. It's that women might need to change, especially women in countries where we have everything. might need to change before one can turn around and say, well, we want to be able to go into combat. All right, if you want to be able to go into combat, grow some...
Then you need to unscrew the lid off your own damn car.
Yeah, grow some proverbial balls, all right? They don't have to be real. They just have to be, figurative, but grow a set. Don't act like... Don't adopt feminist ideas of victimhood. And don't get bitchy about the idea of there being all male units and all female units instead of a mixed unit, because that might work better, all male and all female. If it works better, and if you're really there for the purpose of doing the job and protecting your country, then, you shouldn't be complaining about it. You should be saying, well, since this works better, this is what we're going to do. And it's that way in every job. And I as long as American women are of the mentality, what works for me is more important than what works better, in terms of I am part of this team, and this team has a goal, and I am going to work with this team towards this goal. What works for me is more important than what works better is detrimental to the team. As long as women are of that mentality, they don't belong on that team. Period. But yeah, it has been studied, and it is detrimental to the performance of the unit when you mix the sexes in a unit like that. Then we have Q Brother Soulstar gave us $2 and said, are they the Spanish Inquisition? I don't know. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition.
You never do.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. We don't have the music, dang it. Albert Nada gave us $10 Canadian and said, all the things they accuse men of in a Gillette ad, women do too. Also, please consider YouTuber Tara Babcock for some sort of interview segment. She's definitely pro-guy. Okay. That does sound good. We have Joe Heel gave us... That's £5, I think?
Yeah.
And there's no text with it. So thank you, Joe Heel. Might be Yo Heel. I don't know. Tyler Preston gave us $5 and said, what pisses me off about the Gillette ad is that they still act like male feminists aren't major misogynists, like Kevin Gumbucket Logan. Great. Now, you just gave $5 to I don't know, pussy hats for feminists, the charity. Apollo the Leader gave us $10 and said, nothing to say, just donating to all the channels I've watched for years since my finances are better. Thank you guys. Thank you very much, Apollo. Let's see. Then Syria de Flora gave us $2 and said, PTS That would be me. John Taylor gave us £5 and said, excellent stream as always, and thanks the copies of Xenospora I received in the mail this week. So we'll have to let Alison know that you got your copies. Joe Hill gave us...
She'll be happy to hear that.
Yeah. Gave us £5 and said, at the age of 6, my dad had to hide his tools because I was dismantling things to see how they worked. Oh gosh. No. I got in trouble for that when I was little. My dad showed me how to wire a plug. That's cool. I got in trouble for taking things apart too. I wanted to see what was inside, what would happen, stuff like that. And so my mom had to demonstrate, what if you take one of Hannah's things apart and then don't put it back together, because, I take stuff apart, but I couldn't put it back together. And then, and of course, the solution that I learned was ask first. And, and that was like, there were toys I had that were girls' toys, and there were toys I had that were boys' toys. I had one of those little kids' tool sets, and I had things that you take apart and put back together and stuff like that, and stuff that you build. And I had like all these little weird off-brand building sets to make things out of, because I just loved doing that. And Legos, of course. But yeah, I got in trouble for stuff like that all the time. Take this apart, and that, and yeah, or putting foods together in the kitchen that were not part of a recipe to see what I would concoct, and of course that was not good. And there are things that if you put them together, they blow up. Like the first time I discovered this, the first time I mixed what was it, vinegar and baking soda. That was bad. That made a big mess. And so I was an obnoxious child, just so you know.
Oh, but that sounds cute. It's creative.
Oh yeah, it's really cute until you have to clean
I guess
foam off
so.
of the ceiling in the kitchen.
I guess, yeah.
You just wait. So you're gonna have a smart kid, and then your kid is gonna do the same kind of things.
And then I'll just go and jump in it with them and be like, all right,
There you go.
how big can we make this mess?
Yeah, then you teach them how to use all the cleaning utensils in the house.
Exactly. It's a learning opportunity.
That's right. See, the mop works on the ceiling too. French Honey Badger gave us $5 and said, "Sounds a lot like the pious and the progressive area." Yes, it does actually. What we were talking about, and honestly, there's a lot of femininity I see in pietists, and a lot of pietism I see in modern, particularly modern femininity. And by the way, no, I am not done reading the book. I'm going to go back over the first couple chapters and take some notes. So, and I'm starting a notebook on the new feudalism that's going on. I'm going to probably do some work on that. But that is probably one of the best books I've gotten my hands on in the last couple of years. Miles Kinslow gave us $10 and said, "Hey guys, Jeff Bezos's wife will become one of the richest women in the world." Yes, she will. What will be the feminist response for a woman who got their wealth from marriage, considering hostility to housewives? Oh, you know what? I bet they won't say a damn word. Yeah, no. They won't say a word. And if you bring her up to them, they're going to start talking about how hard it was to be his wife and how much she was owed that money because she was his wife. And
how do you get owed billions of dollars though? Like,
yeah, I guess what they're basically saying, because like isn't the marriage ending because he has a mistress?
I'm honestly not 100% sure.
Yeah,
but
so what they're basically saying is if you marry a woman, she owns your body, and you owe her money for the right to do with it what you would please. Whereas if a woman wants to cheat on her husband and, you criticize her for that, that's slut-shaming, right? That's what you're going to basically hear from feminists on this one. The poor, maligned wife.
Isn't the idea that cheating is wrong just an aspect of enforced monogamy?
Yep, it is.
So
you would think that's the patriarchy, right?
Hey,
yeah.
So they're
Everything is
smashing it.
patriarchy.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
She's really getting back at the patriarchy for what they've done to her.
Except in a way she's capitalizing on it. Because she's getting paid to be outraged.
Using her feminine power to get back at the patriarchy.
Hannah, that's just compensation.
Anyway.
Yeah,
you
that's
can just twist this anyway.
It's just compensation.
She's getting compensated for being outraged over his use of his bodily autonomy in a hurtful way.
She doesn't need the bicycle, but she's going to unscrew the wheels and take the handlebar, and might as well take this chain too while we're at it. She's gonna
take the seat, and he can have the post that it was mounted on.
Exactly.
Have a seat, dude. So there you go. Then we have Hokey Bukisa gave us $4.99. Says it's not just the military. Segregated workspaces and classrooms do better too. And this is an odd one, but when I worked at the gas station that I worked at, we used to get a delivery twice a week. We'd get a delivery truck in. They bring in our stock that we were selling and everything. And when we had a team of all women there to put it away, or a team of all guys there to put it away, it would get put away faster. If we had both sexes working, it took longer. And there was a little bit of an investigation. And come to find out, they were stopping to chit-chat. So, Yeah. It's you didn't see so much stopping. Even when it was all women, there was less stopping to chit chat than when it was women and men working together. And then the other thing was, and this was something that I figured out. I was bigger and stronger than the other girls I was working with. And while I'm not a heavy lifter, I could do pretty good. And we had these bag-in-the-boxes. It's literally a bag of liquid inside a cardboard box with in one end, the piece that you hook up to the soda fountain sticks out, and that's your syrup for your pop. And the less popular pop came in 15-pound bag-in-the-boxes, and the more popular pop came in 50-pound bag-in-the-boxes. And by the way, Diet Mountain Dew syrup looks like toxic waste when it's in a bag-in-the-box, when it's all concentrated. Oh my God, it's the most horrible looking. You're like, am I going to get cancer from carrying this back there because it's glowing? But anyway,
burns if it goes on you.
Yeah, but these 15-pound bag-in-the-boxes, you can lift a 50-pound bag-in-the-box. You can lift 3 15-pound bag-in-the-boxes. Well, they're cardboard, so they don't have any traction. So you only want to lift 2. And the reason you only want to lift 2 is because you can control 2. But if you put a third one on top, it's likely to fall off. And that's a disaster. So I would pick up 2 of them and take them to the back. The guy I was working with saw that I had picked up 2 and he had to pick up 3. And why? Because if I could lift 2, he had to be able to... He cannot let himself not work as hard or harder than I did. And he was
he can't let a woman beat him at a guy thing, which is lifting shit. Yeah.
So I had to go back to lifting 1 because he was gonna hurt himself. He was stronger than me, but he was not so much stronger than me that he could have controlled 3 slippery cardboard boxes with weight inside that was liquid, and therefore every time you move, it slams against the inside of the box and pushes the box one direction or another. So, you're not just carrying, you have to adjust your body to prevent the boxes from falling, or you end up with a mess and the loss of a whole week's worth of Big Red or 7-Up or something like that. And so we had to be careful with stuff like that. So the way a woman works and what a woman is doing can affect what a guy has to do. And that expectation that I'm going to be looked down at if I am not doing as good as or better than somebody who is demonstrably weaker than me, even if I'm not enough stronger than her to accommodate the things that I need to do in order to outdo her. That can be very dangerous to a guy, and they are expected, and they are naturally, I guess, endowed or cursed with a tendency to take bigger risks than they see women taking. Oh God! And Phi Pi Delta says, "Bag in a box, turn the lever, and Andrea Dworkin suddenly pops out." I know pop is unhealthy for you, but that's going a little far.
Yeah, it's pop, not cancer.
There we go. And then Albert Nada gave us $5 Canadian and said, Benzo's wife deserves that money. She carried him while he was building his company. She's not some bimbo that came along after the fact. That might be the case. And I don't know. But I know one thing. It wouldn't matter if that was true or not to feminists. They would have the same reaction regardless. And I just the idea that just cheating alone makes you deserve half the money is galling to me. Crawl Dragon gave us $5 and said, bags of pop are all very well, but what do you do with the boxes of popped cherries?
Pop them some more.
There we go. Well, honestly, if we're going to be talking about bags, boxes, and popped things, I need bubble wrap. But unfortunately, I don't have any. So with that, I think we've got all of the super chats at this point. We've been going for about an hour and 40 minutes. The one point I wanted to bring home and I want to get people's take on is going back to, we've discussed a lot of different things about like men and women and the idea of patriarchy versus the idea of it just being something natural. The Gillette commercial, I do want to have a little bit of discussion about the Gillette commercial in and of itself. And I know we've talked a little bit about it, but one of the things that I pointed out in the opening monologue, and this goes into the Gillette commercial in terms of finances, is how much money there is in the so-called patriarchy funding and financing feminist endeavors. Now, Gillette's a big company that's part of a big company. It's Procter and Gamble. And like they're huge.
And when Procter and Gamble acquired them, they had a 70% market share for razors.
Yeah, so they're
most
huge.
of it on the back of that ad
Yeah.
that I talked about from the Super Bowl in 1989. Most of it on the back of that campaign, right? Which, I mean, it was repeated in shorter versions and slightly different versions for 2 decades after that. Gillette, the best a man can get. I even remember one of the guys on, what was it? It was one of those home and garden TV shows where they redo people's rooms. And one of the handymen on that who, you know, would build bookshelves, the nail gun and all of that. He was actually in one of the Gillette commercials that was airing at the time, because he had the perfect jawline essentially.
Right.
And, you know, like, I mean, like it was just, and it was always Gillette, the best a man can get. And it was always the woman coming and putting her hand on his cheek and it's so smooth, or the man rubbing his cheek against the head of his small child and not setting it on
scratching.
fire from friction, right? And all of those things, right? So I mean, it was all like
It was all positive. And then suddenly it's negative. But what I wanted to point out is there is another example of a giant organization, a huge corporation, funneling money into promoting a feminist narrative. Because that ad is accusing male society in general of having toxic masculinity. Well, now, remember what I just talked about in the store regarding the guy that had to be stronger than me. Feminists would call that toxic masculinity. But if we were cooking and I had to make better food than him and I had to be fancier with my cooking than him, would they call that toxic femininity? Probably not. Because most feminists, when you start bringing up the idea of toxic femininity, get offended. Oh, that competitiveness is a masculine trait. Competitiveness isn't feminine, and right?
Toxic femininity isn't actually that. It's just internalized misogyny.
Right.
You just feel you have to outdo him in the kitchen because you're oppressed.
Exactly. So it's a one-way narrative. It's a narrative that is falsely gendered. It has nothing to do with their company or their image or promoting their product or endearing themselves to the public. The only reason for having that ad the way that ad was made is to preach feminist ideology that is not otherwise believable to the masses. And this is the patriarchy. This is women are oppressed under this. That we get this, women are promoted in this way and men are demoted in this way, or not demoted but demonized in this way at the expense of this denigrated. Yeah, at the expense of this big company. Really?
Well, I don't know how often they have to make this mistake before they realize that there's a reason why the phrase "go get broke" is a thing. Like, everybody's talking about, these guys have decided that the MRA money isn't worth it, so now they're catering against you. It's like, okay, well,
yeah, like we're so fucking rich, right? You know,
exactly.
I'm just like sucking at the government teat here. I have like grants coming out the wazoo, right? Like the government's like throwing money at me and saying, please just spend it on men, pay them to rape women,
There
right?
you go.
Just anything. spend it on men because that's what the patriarchy is for. Like, fuck, what? I don't...
Yeah.
Like,
This
you
is
know,
exactly
and
what I
most,
mean.
most MRAs, anybody who does MRAing for a living is poor.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can't say that I do it for a living. I mean, I do get paid to produce the opening video and host the show, but I have a full-time job in addition to this. This is a part-time job now, in addition to a full-time job, on top of which I also volunteer for other things. So yeah, you know, you have no money is coming in from the government to us. There is no patriarchy funding us, although it would be nice if there was. One of the things I pointed out in the opening monologue, the Ford Foundation.
Yeah, they
puts
I'm still waiting for my check.
Billions
I'm waiting,
into feminism.
Waiting for my check from them. It hasn't arrived, but I'm still hopeful.
No, they won't fund us because they think we're right wing. They won't fund us. They fund a lot of left wing organizations. The Ford Foundation, in fact, people talk about George Soros. George Soros is a red herring. George Soros puts a few $100,000 in here and there, $1 million once in a while into something. The Ford Foundation puts probably 10 to 50 times as much money into the kind of things that Soros is funding. They put out 10 to 50 times as much into
the
those
Rockefellers
same,
do.
You know, and the Rockefeller Foundation does as well. Yeah, you're right. And then there's a third one, and I can't think of the name.
Rothschild?
No, I'll think of it later when it's not useful. But there are three big foundations that put a shitload of money into a lot of initiatives that really are about promoting socialism, Marxism, progressivism, the victim identity politics, and so on.
Oh, the Rockefeller Foundation actually spent $28 million over the course of 4 years.
Carnegie
paid it.
Carnegie, the Best the World Has to Offer channel named it the Carnegie Foundation.
There you go. Well, the Rockefeller Foundation put $7 million a year for 4 years, $28 million total, into the pockets of environmentalist groups and native indigenous First Nations bands, right, to block pipelines in Canada.
Yeah. Well, the thing that really struck me when I learned about it was the bit about the Ford Foundation funding the women's studies phenomenon. In the 60s, actually the late 50s, there was one in Australia, one women's studies class in Australia, and it wasn't called women's studies. It had another name, and it was kind of the prototype women's studies course. And then the United States, feminists in the United States started, there was a women's studies course at this school and a women's studies course at that school, and they would have different names for them as well. It wouldn't be called women's studies. Well then, and I can't remember what school it was, but there was a professor who actually went to the Ford Foundation with a couple of years of having run a women's studies course in her school under her belt. Couple of years under her belt, she goes to the Ford Foundation and says, I would like to turn this into something bigger. And they gave her tons of money. They funded the creation of a department. And they funded the production and sharing of materials. And the next thing you know, there's hundreds of women's studies courses. And there are fledgling women's studies departments at universities all over the United States. And by the 90s, so about 20 years later, by the 90s, every major university had a women's studies department, and not just a women's studies course. And so by the time I graduated from high school and I was at university, even the technical college that I went to, which was on a satellite campus for a state college, had a women's studies department. You could graduate with a degree in women's studies And, we talk a lot about how, you're going to become a barista with that degree. Well, that's not really the case.
No.
You graduate with a degree like that. You become the woman who goes in and operates the training, runs the training for judges and bailiffs and other court personnel that is mandated by the Violence Against Women Act.
Or you get hired into an HR department. Like, this is one of the things that I come up against again and again and again when I go on these right-wing talk radio shows, because a lot of these guys are sort of politically aware, right? They talk politics all the time, but they're talking right versus left. But they ask, and particularly with the collapse of the women's marches and, sort of the distancing of the local and regional chapters from the national leadership and all of these things, and canceling marches for being too white, and then canceling other marches because Tamika Mallory and Linda Sarsour are notorious anti-Semites, and they're, like in bed with Louis Farrakhan in a, loving Muslim sandwich, and all of these things, right? So they're like, well, like, how did, like, because it's almost like it snuck up on them, right? It snuck up on them, and they're like, how the hell did this happen? How did we get to this point? And I'm like, this is just the culmination of a 50-year plan.
Yeah.
This is the culmination of 50 years. And you don't even need to be a conspiracy theorist to understand how it works. You have these disciplines that began with women's studies in the early 1970s, right? They are considered activist disciplines. They were back then. What they do is they criticize society. They make a critique of society. They describe everything that is wrong and unjust with society. And then they require, as part of the curriculum, that the students engage in political activism to make change, right? So you have, and they do it within this framework of there's a class of oppressors and there's a class of oppressed people, and that's unjust, and everything is examined through this lens of power relations within society. And so you have what's already an antagonistic, a fundamentally antagonistic way of looking at things, right? There's oppressors and there are oppressed, and the oppressed need to liberate themselves from the oppressors, right? And the whole course is about critiquing the systematic and the systemic and the institutional aspects of how the oppressors maintain their power and all of this shit and keep other people subordinated, right? So women, minorities, all of that stuff. And you have to go out and be politically active. You have to go out and protest. It's part of the credit that you earn is to go out and do that, right? We saw that at the Warren Farrell protest, where there was a woman who was being interviewed by Steve Brule, who said, yeah, I came here as part of my women's studies course. My professor said I should come here.
Yep, I'm getting college credit for this. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have a bunch of people who are highly motivated, highly politically active. They're true believers in the doctrine, right? They want to change society. And so where are they going to go? Where are they going to go after they graduate with this mindset? This passionate, true believer desire to either change society or proselytize so that other people are able to come around to our way of thinking, right? So it is really like a religious movement in that way.
And they become priestesses, basically.
They become priestesses, so they go into the law, they go into social work, they go into education, they go into academia, they go into
domestic violence victim services advocacy,
journalism, they go into non-profits, they go into law enforcement, they go into HR departments,
consultation,
they go into consultancy firms, they go into marketing, they go into communications, they go into politics and speech writing and advisory ad hoc advisory councils, right, on this, that, or the other social problem, right? They go into all of these places, right? And maybe 40 years ago, in those areas, only 10% of the people in those areas were these people. But now you're looking at the editorial board of the New York Times or, some other nationally respected newspaper being 100% of people, because it didn't, even though they didn't graduate from women's studies, right? Not every person on the editorial board of the New York Times, right, graduated from a women's studies program. But while all of those women's studies graduates went and got their assistant professorships in sociology and psychology and anthropology and all kinds of other, and the humanities and all of these other areas, right? They've been seeding the curriculum with the doctrine.
Right.
Right? So you can go and you can get a degree in political science, and you're almost a completely fully indoctrinated women's studies graduate. Yeah. You've been fed a steady diet for like 4 or 6 or 8 years of this bullshit, right? And then you go and you write speeches for Obama or Clinton or whoever, and you spread the gospel, and it just spreads like that. And so what we're seeing now is because these people are motivated to proselytize and to change the systems that are in place and the institutions that are in place, they've gone into the positions in which they are most effective at doing that, which are the gatekeepers of information and the people who direct policy and law.
And they're actually everywhere except the hard sciences, and they are attempting to sort of take over the hard sciences on top of everything else. This is the part of the reason for the push to get more women in STEM, is they don't want more women in STEM. They want more feminists in STEM. They don't care so much to put more non-feminist women in STEM, just more feminist women. And that's like, that push has been there for, it's just like we hear about it now. We've heard about it for the last several years, and I mean, that's been there for probably about 40 years. I was hearing stuff about this, not articulated quite as openly or bluntly or blatantly as it is now, when I was a kid, and they started putting kids who were good at math, specifically math and reading. If you were specifically good at math and reading in elementary school, they put you into a gifted program. And in the gifted program, the girls got a lot more attention than the guys. Now, in my class, there were more guys in the class than there were girls, but the girls still got more attention. And there was more about, you're female, therefore you need to push yourself to get into these areas. Society's pushing you not to go into these areas, and it's your job to resist it. And it's not just feminism needing something to complain about and something to do, because they can always come up with that. They don't need to do it. It's about getting inroads into those areas for feminism. And like I'm looking, when I talk about the various money things, when I talk about the various amounts of money that feminists rely on the system they call patriarchy for, one of the things I talk about is how lucrative it is to turn everything into a feminist job. The other end of it is all of these, there is a shitload of grants, government grants, that identity politics ideologues are suited for, or rather that are designed to be suitable to identity politics ideologues. And a lot of it came out of the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act formula grants, for instance, you had this set of funds, some for an advocate to go to court, some for an advocate that was specific to only women who were accusing partners who were in law enforcement. Those are two separate advocates. Both are funded by the Violence Against Women Act. Then you have this one Funds may be used for the following statutory program purpose areas: training law enforcement officers, judges, and other personnel and prosecutors to more effectively identify and respond to violent crimes against women, and their training in the Duluth model, basically. And this is, then to developing, training, or expanding units of law enforcement officers, judges, and other court personnel and prosecutors specifically targeting violent crimes against women. So that would be their only job. Developing, installing, or expanding data collection and communication systems, including computerized systems, linking police, prosecutors, and courts for the purpose of identifying, classifying, and tracking arrests, protections orders, violations of protections orders, prosecutions, and convictions for violent crimes against women, including the crimes of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Developing, enlarging, or strengthening victim services and legal assistance programs, including sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking programs. Developing or improving delivery of victim services to underserved populations, strictly for women. And then collecting data. Collecting data from those units. So they basically say, yeah, we're going to fund shelters and services and advocates that only serve women, and then we're going to collect our data from there, and then we can say that only women have this problem. And that is how we train our law enforcement, that only women have this problem, and that only men perpetrate, and that they have this specific attitude when they do it, and this specific set of responses is what's appropriate. And then when feminists hear us complain about it, they blame the patriarchy.
Even if they say, yeah, I hit my wife, but it's not because I want to dominate her. It's not because I see her as a lesser or inferior being, right? They just say, well, you have false consciousness and you need to be re-educated.
Yeah. And then when we talk about what is happening in the court system, where a guy can get stabbed by his wife, and he calls the cops, and they will arrest him because she broke a nail on the knife she stabbed him with. That's patriarchy. Patriarchy makes them do that, right? Patriarchy makes them unable to see him as the victim. Patriarchy makes the prosecutor decide that he needs to be prosecuted. Patriarchy is the reason that when he called for victim services, there wasn't anything for him but a perpetrator program. No, it was the Violence Against Women Act that was lobbied for by feminists who went in and cited feminist writing, Susan Brown Miller's writing, and cherry-picked from Erin Pitzy's work, so they know what they were saying is not true, because they read her work.
Cherry-picking work is what they do best. It's how the whole peer review system seems to work now.
And you know how it got passed? You know how it got passed? It got passed using statistics collected from a survey method by one Mary P. Koss, women's studies professor at Kent State University here in Ohio.
And it all comes full circle.
Yep.
Well, it's the same thing with, feminists like Big Red screaming, feminists do not want you to lose custody of your kids, the idea that
patriarchy.
The idea that women are, women has vaginas, so women looks after babies, right? That's part of patriarchy. It's like, except for there's no woman in the world who is forced by patriarchy to demand sole custody of her kids, to not share custody with the father. And there's no feminist group in the world who's required by patriarchy to oppose shared parenting bills.
Well, and then the other end of it is the idea that women are better caregivers is not part of patriarchy. It was written, the Tender Years doctrine was drawn from the writing of Carolyn Norton and her penning of the Custody of Infants Act of 1839, and her plain letter to the Lord Chancellor promoting that act, in which she made the plea that God made women better caregivers. God made mothers more important to their children. It was from a feminist activist. Now, she may have had very good reason to protest her situation. She was experiencing parental alienation. And parental alienation is wrong regardless of which parent it's done to and which parent the child is deprived of through it.
Yeah.
But it still isn't the patriarchy when a woman went to the parliament and said, you must do this because God says so. And they said, okay.
Well, okay, I will tell you. I will tell you that it has always been an ethic, right? An ethic among humans that women are better suited towards the care of small children than men are. It's women's boobs here serving the drinks, right? All of those things, right? But the idea that the hands-on care, right? That the hands-on maternal style care was more important than the authority figure, the person who paid the bills, the person who kept the lights on and the water running and all of those things, right? That was what Carolyn Norton, I think, changed, right? The idea that the woman's role, because that was always seen as the woman's role, and she was always seen as better suited to it, to the hands-on care, right, than men were, right? But it was the idea that the woman's role was more important to the child than the man's role. That is what she changed. That is what she
changed was whether the law enforced it. What she changed was she made it a legal mandate. She persuaded the government to make it all because one woman went in there and said shit. The government made it a legal mandate. Whereas before,
her story was pretty sad.
And yeah, her story was pretty sad. Her what was done to her was very wrong. It's wrong to do it to a man. It's wrong to do it to a woman. It's wrong to do it to the children. Her son got sick and died and did not get to see his mother again before he died.
Uh-oh.
Because what?
Oh no. We're gonna get some double talk reverse robo in a minute.
Are you losing me?
There,
we lost you for a second.
Yeah, no, her son died without getting to see his mother again before he died because the father was alienating her from the children as punishment basically for their separation. That was very wrong, and he was a fucking son of a bitch for that. Just the same as any woman who does that to her husband. That's a shit move, and it's child abuse, and it's abuse of the other parent.
It would have been really nice. It would have been really nice if Carolyn Norton had, instead of saying women are the appropriate caregivers for children and should get custody, if she just essentially said, I think as a mother, I should have an equal role in as custodian and guardian of my children.
It would have been nice if she'd have gone in and asked for equal treatment instead of superior treatment. But she didn't. And people in those situations often don't. But in any case, I think if a man had gone in with the same story, I don't think that the state would have had the level of sympathy for him that the state had for a woman with that kind of a story. Now, men had custody at that time. Like, he got custody because...
No. Well,
unless the child was born out of wedlock, and
men had default custody at the time, but there were a lot of legal exemptions.
Oh yeah, there were.
There were a lot of legal exemptions that allowed women to get custody, and in some jurisdictions in the United States and the United Kingdom, right, even when there was default father custody on the law books, there were actually more separated and divorced mothers with custody of children than men.
Right. It was if it was uncontested, the man got custody. Whereas now, if it's uncontested, the woman gets custody. If it is contested, though, now the man has a hell of a time getting custody. Whereas back then, when it was defaulting to paternal custody, the reverse was not true. The mother didn't have a hell of a time getting custody. And then the other thing is, if the father left, he was considered guilty of abandonment and could be prosecuted. Like, even then, even after no-fault divorce, the father cannot just leave and not support the family or he can be considered a deadbeat dad. It's a different terminology, but it's the same thing. He's guilty of abandonment, and he can be prosecuted. And if the mother leaves, and the mother takes the children far away, and he cannot see them, or if the mother doesn't even tell him, I got pregnant and I had your baby, and 20 years from now she comes along and says, oh, by the way, you owe me child support, he can be considered guilty of abandonment and prosecuted. So it's like the situation has been dramatically changed in women's favor and at women's behest. And it's definitely not something that has happened for the benefit of men or because men are in charge. It's happened because women have played victim of their own choices. And that's Norton wasn't necessarily in that situation where she was totally victim of her own choice. But she definitely her reaction to it was a strong contributing factor. The idea that women are better caregivers under the law came from her. Under English common law came from her. Across the board. Yeah. So that was again, that's a feminist exploitation of the system they call patriarchy. Where patriarchy is the idea that men are in charge of society because the majority of people who are in positions of responsibility that come with a certain amount of power are men. I'm going to head into some more super chats here. And I think, it's scrolled automatically, so I have to back up a little bit. So we stopped at Bags of Pop. Anth Bobo gave us $5 Canadian and said Procter & Gamble, the same company that uses child labor and tests their products on animals. I have to say this. I don't know about the child labor. I would be more interested to find out about that. I'm assuming it's in foreign countries because I don't think they could get away with it here in the U.S. But animal testing, I don't necessarily oppose animal testing. I don't necessarily think it should be the norm if there are other things that you can do. But I'm not an animal rights activist in terms of, never test products on animals. I think testing makeup on animals is stupid. If you have to test it on an animal, maybe makeup's not all that important. But if you're testing, medication and stuff like that, it's a totally different thing.
Oh, it's a game changer. We wouldn't have nearly the medical.
Yeah.
Didn't, but
if I got to choose between my kid's health and the health of a rabbit, or the experiences a rabbit has, the rabbit can go fuck itself.
Well, you ladies do know that there was a lab in Germany about 6-7 years ago that had developed a type of engineered lab-grown human skin.
Yeah.
To spare the animals that are subjected to animal testing.
What did they grow it from?
Yeah. Baby foreskins.
Yeah. No, I'm not.
Yeah. All
Screw those guys too. No.
And they said, you need to get the foreskin from kids under 4 years old because after that, the stem cells aren't as the fibroblasts aren't as good, and they're not as transferable. They're not as universal. They change as the kid gets older and become less usable. And so it has to be babies.
Yeah. Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. So there's their idea. It's more humane to them to create wounds on the genitalia of infant boys than it is to test their products on animals. But and patriarchy, right?
Right.
Christy Winters. Oh no, my dyslexia is taking effect again. Christy Winters did not give us any money. Ignore that. She's a skinflint. But Tyler Preston, on the other hand, gave us $2 and said, "Christy Winters, but my patriarchy." And that's.
Oh,
what you get.
I lost all respect for her when she entered into that debate with Sargon.
You had respect for her?
No,
Really?
You lost the ability to develop respect for her?
Yeah, there you go. She went into that debate with Sargon. It was a debate where they had to cite all of their sources beforehand, which is absolutely stupid. I would never enter a debate on those terms. because you never know what the other side's going to bring up and what you're going to need to rebut, right?
Right.
Of course.
But she said that apparently the appellate court in Oklahoma had decided that orally raping a passed out woman in Oklahoma was not a crime, right? Because all the jury and the judges and everybody said yes, she was passed out, drunk, and he stuck his dick in her mouth and he ejaculated into her mouth and then he dumped her on her grandmother's doorstep. And she woke up with semen in and on around her mouth and no memory of what had happened. And the appellate court had said that this was not a crime. They acquitted the guy, right? And that's what all the feminist media was saying. It's not a crime in Oklahoma to orally rape a passed out woman, right? So they're essentially telling all of the rapists in Oklahoma, hey, there's a totally legal way for you to rape women. Just do it this way, right? When in reality, the whole story was the prosecutor had decided, because it didn't fit the definition of rape under Oklahoma statutes, because that was vaginal or anal, and it did not fit the definition of forcible sodomy, right? Because there was no element of force, because she was passed out, so he didn't have to hold her down, he didn't have to, pin her down or anything like that, right? But the prosecutor decided that he, instead of charging this guy with sexual battery, okay, he would charge him with forcible sodomy and try and stretch the law. And the appellate court said, we don't see any need to expand the definition of force under the statutes to encompass something that does not fit it. It's not our job to write law. We are only here to interpret the law, and there is nothing in the statute and nothing in the case law that suggests that this was an act that involved an element of force as defined by Oklahoma law. I'm sorry, you should have charged him with sexual battery.
Yeah. This is typical of feminists too. If you don't do it my way, you didn't do it. Even if you did it another way or could have done it another way, if it didn't get done because my way was wrong, then you didn't do it at all. When it comes to the law, if you didn't label it rape, you are condoning it totally, completely, 100%. Even if the guy would have been convicted on another statute. Now, turn it around,
Canada's a rape culture because we don't actually have a rape statute.
Right. So turn it around, and if MRAs complain that the UK does not label rape what it is, if the perpetrator is female, and feminists are like, well, but it's the same crime, just basically it's sexual assault. Even if it carries a lower sentence, which it does, when a woman perpetrates against a man, they don't consider it, like, the idea that the maximum sentence is higher for the crime that a woman can commit than the minimum sentence for rape is enough for them. They think that's enough, that men should just shut up and put up with the difference in law, and that it's just something special, that the penis has this special magic power to make rape that much worse, and it doesn't matter what conditions might be inflicted on men who have been sexually victimized by fertile women. The fact that there are certain conditions that can be inflicted upon fertile women when they're sexually victimized by fertile men makes it worse. So they're completely solipsistic in that. It's bad when it happens to them, that they're subject to a different standard. But when men are subject to a different standard that makes their rights less recognized and their bodily autonomy less recognized, that's not supposed to be any big deal. And I think part of that is because women are so used to walking all over men's bodily autonomy anyway. Right down to the point where, you go out on a double date with another chick and her guy, and you get to see her taking food off of his plate. Like, this I would not do well if I was a guy and I took a gal out. Like, she'd stick her hand over my plate and there'd be a fork in it. That's I don't understand how anybody can think that's okay. You know, it'd be different if she says, you got something different than I got and it looks good, but I was afraid to get it. Can I try it so I know the next time whether I might want to get it or not? And you can try some of mine, you know, if you want. That's different. That's, you know, sharing and finding out information, and, you know, you like this, it might be good, you know. But just to reach over and grab like that, women, you know, it just will walk all over guys that way. And it's, they'll try to dress their guy. You can't wear that shirt. You got to wear this shirt. You got to get rid of that shirt. It's too ugly. You know, totally. They'll try to pick his friends. You can't hang out with that guy anymore. I don't like him. You know, okay, well, you don't have to hang out with him. You know, he can hang out with him without you. You know, just like shit like that. You got to get a different car. You got to get it, you know, this, you got to do that. Go ask your boss for a raise. Why don't you change jobs? You know, and it's not, I support you in improving your situation. I support you in, you know, choosing to change your style to suit your new job or whatever. It's, I demand that you do these things for me. So I can understand why feminists might not understand the lack of boundaries, you know, the idea that men are faced with a different standard when it comes to their bodily autonomy being violated. But I can't accept it. But we got another one, a whole bunch more super chats here actually. Chris Stewart says, I want to ensure everyone, I think you mean assure everyone, that I am no friend of communism. That said, I'm curious as to how you would react to the MRA group with communist ideals. Nothing about advocating men's rights seems inherently against Marxism. And I would say, well, except for that bit about other people not necessarily being entitled to just take men's earnings and men's achievements and turn them into women's possessions and women's property. Which is what, you know, that's kind of a Marxist aspect of feminism. And I think a Marxist approach to fixing that would never work.
Yeah. I think too, like, I mean, I've never really given that sort of thing too much thought because realistically speaking, I'm focused on like the men aspect. It's not necessarily the political affiliation, but I mean, like even Anna a few times on the show has kind of joked about being a communist and things like that. And she is very, very left leaning. So, I mean, I can talk with MRAs of any political stripe, right? Like it's about the men aspect that interests me. I know like you guys might have different views on that, but for me, it's always been more politically neutral in that regard.
Yeah, my own take on gender issues in general is this. We're in a human rights discussion. We're talking about human rights and we're talking about civil rights. Human rights being, you know, your natural rights, and civil rights being how the government protects your natural rights. And in my opinion, regardless of whether you are dealing with a society that enforces them all in an authoritarian manner or enforces standards in an authoritarian manner, or whether you are dealing with a society that is geared more towards simply not interfering with their recognition and free exercise. The bottom line is, if something is going to be recognized as a human right, bodily autonomy, the right to non-interference from outsiders in terms of your use of what you have acquired through your earning of it, you know, those kinds of things, the right to free exercise of speech, the right to the free practice of religion or aversion to, you know, a religion, basically avoidance of religion. all of those things. If something's going to be recognized as a human right, and we are going to enumerate civil rights around the protections of those human rights, a person's sex shouldn't affect the level of recognition and the level of protection or the repercussions somebody faces if they violate somebody else's rights. So no matter what type of system of government you advocate, whether it is authoritarian or libertarian, whether it's far left, far right, anything in the middle, those fit all of it. The big question is, I think the men's rights movement benefits more than it loses from the fact that we have represented among our number left, right, authoritarian, libertarian, and everything in between, everything on that spectrum. Personally, I am a more non-interference oriented person, so I'm more of a libertarian oriented person. And it's slowly being dragged towards Ancapistan by some of our friends. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if someone came out and said, I'm a communist and I have started a petition to send to Congress to get Congress to make a law that says domestic violence victim shelters cannot discriminate against male abuse victims, that it doesn't mean that I would look at that person and say, well, good luck to you, I'm not getting involved because you're a communist. You know, if they're going to work towards that goal, I would have to see something in that law to put me off of it in order for me to not cooperate with them. As long as it was basically, this is to stop these centers from discriminating against abused men, then I would go along with it. I would work with them on it. It wouldn't matter.
And the thing is too, is that these are state-funded shelters, right? So it's not as if you're saying, oh, well, you know, it's not as if you're interfering with the ability of a private organization to its freedom of association or its ability to you know, decide what it wants to do. You're essentially saying you receive government funds. This was why Mark Angelucci won in the state of California on domestic violence issues, was because they're state-funded shelters. They're taxpayer-funded shelters. Men pay for these services and they don't get them. That's not okay. And if you're going to receive state money, you have to obey state law. And in California, they actually have some of the strictest anti-discrimination laws in the world, and they work both ways. They cut both ways for now.
Yep. So, like, in terms of what kind of political outlook you have, I really don't think that there's anything you could say. Even feminism, like, I'm opposed to feminist ideals. I'm opposed to what their dogma actually says. I'm opposed to the lobbying they've engaged in, and I'm opposed to the vast majority of practices and beliefs held and operated by people who call themselves feminists. Okay, but there are people who call themselves feminists who are basically just egalitarians in feminist clothing, and I would not have any problem working with a feminist that's really more egalitarian toward anything the government is doing like that. Any government funded initiative, saying, hey, you can't just charge men for this and give it to women. You have to let men benefit from it too. I would not be in any way, shape, or form. I would work with a radical feminist to stop circumcision. If I would stand shoulder to shoulder with anybody, that would step forward and say you can't cut infant genitals, and protest in front of Congress or whatever. I would sign anybody's petition that didn't advocate anything else but no more infant male circumcision. Make it as outlawed as female circumcision. So it's more about the issues than it is about the ideology.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad, for example, that the Center for Men and Families here were trying apply for government grants, and some of them we're actually getting. So, the sign of better times, hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yep, hopefully. Yeah, so that's basically my take, and I think basically we've gone through and answered the question of men's rights versus Marxism. Now, I will say, feminism really is kind of a Marxist ideology in and of itself, and what they have done in terms of our laws, that has actually been extremely damaging. And the reason it is the way it is because they have identified a victim class and a perpetrator class, and or a privileged class, and they have used the reasoning that is inherent to Marxist ideology to justify infringing on the human rights of the supposed privileged class for the benefit of the supposed victim class. That should not happen with the men's rights movement. The movement really can't afford to become another feminism, and that would be the one fear I would have with respect to making Marxist ideals the forefront of the men's rights movement. I think it's better that we have that they're part of the spectrum of various political outlooks that's involved in the men's rights movement rather than the forefront. And I would say that I think about pretty much any of our political ideals. I don't think the movement itself would necessarily benefit from my beliefs, like my political outlook being the forefront either. I think it's important that we look at all of the different ways of doing things, because what we're fighting for is sort of outside of all of them, and we should use every tool in our toolbox to achieve equal human rights recognition and equal civil rights recognition. But moving on to the next super chat, Chris Stewart says, I meant to say AMRA, not the MRA, last super chat. That makes sense. Chris Stewart says, know any MRA/red-pilled lesbians? I've run into a few. And it's interesting. One of the ways in which lesbians can end up red-pilled is by ending up on the wrong side of a false accusation of domestic violence. And I have run into a couple of lesbians on Twitter who are dealing with ordeals of... I've actually advised one on documentation, dealing with ordeals of malicious prosecution at the hands of an ex-girlfriend who basically was pissed off that they moved on to another girl. And that like immediately they figure out that the system is messed up, and the first accuser gets whatever they want, especially if they are accusing someone who is gender atypical in her presentation.
Yeah, that's pretty messed up. I mean, it's messed up that they would use it like in any way at all, but I mean, it's messed up that they'll just like figure out, oh, this is a thing that I can use to exploit this situation.
Mm-hmm. And that's basically what happens with men. I can get the house, I can get the car, I can get a regular stipend, blah, 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 if I just say he hit me. And I know in some states, you can get a guy kicked out of his house even if you are not on the mortgage or the lease. You can force him to pay all the bills at that house, and you can live there because you have accused him of domestic violence. It's really bad. So, and if you do the same thing in a lesbian relationship, you get the same benefit. So yeah, there are lesbians who are very red-pilled, and there are also lesbians who are red-pilled by another thing. We all know from looking at the Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey done by the CDC, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, we know that sexual violence is highest among lesbians. But at the other end of it, and this is a direct result of feminist attitudes about acknowledging female perpetration of intimate partner and sexual violence, it gets covered up a lot. And when lesbians who have been subjected, who have been victimized by their partners, or when women who have been victimized by lesbians who are sexually violent, or who are just criminally violent, when they go for help, they get treated like they are betraying the sisterhood. And this is a really rough thing. It's hard to go to any therapist and tell that therapist that you were sexually victimized by a female perpetrator if you are female. I'm sure it's very hard. It's probably just as hard if you're male. If you're female, you have all of the same kind of denials that you get if you're a male. You know, like men get told that you must have wanted it because men want it all the time. Women get told you must have given lesbian signals. Maybe you're secretly a lesbian and you just didn't know it. And you're just denying your sexuality. And you know, this person didn't rape you. She was just teaching you about your sexuality. You know, it's like it's so sickening to hear it that talking about it later will make you feel sick. And you're on top of that, you get this. It's not an overt accusation that you are betraying the sisterhood. It's little statements like, you know, if this kind of thing gets out, it will undermine LGBT activism. And, you know, and you certainly don't want to undermine LGBT activism, do you? So this is definitely something to keep quiet, right? That is basically, yeah, we're going to throw you under the bus because we don't want to get in the way of gay marriage. And yeah, so there are people who are red-pilled who are part of the LGBT movement because they have been thrown under the bus that way. So now that's not what red-pilled me, but I have been thrown under the bus that way. And then I was thrown under the bus that way when I was young.
No.
Yeah, now.
Oh no!
Have we lost
Anna.
you again?
There you are.
Okay. My OBS is showing green. So if my Discord isn't putting me through, OBS might be. So type it in, don't shout, because you might be shouting over me and they can hear me, but you can't. But yeah, like I said, there are a lot of LGBT activists that have become red-pilled because they were thrown under the bus that way. And like I said, I was not red-pilled by that, but I was thrown under the bus. So that's the reason why I know that happens. And I've talked to other people who have had the same kind of experience. Actually having a therapist, a person who makes their money helping people come back from the brink, right? Sit there and tell you that you don't know what your sexuality is. And what the person did to you wasn't bad. They were just helping you understand your sexuality. And you don't want to talk about this too much because you might undermine LGBT activism and, you know, all this other stuff.
Yeah, that sounds
I know
pretty
my sexuality.
abusive.
Yeah, I know my sexuality, and even even worse is if you're sexual. Like, I'm bisexual, but it doesn't mean that I want to screw every woman that I see. You
Yeah,
know?
of course. It's like saying that you want to screw every man that you see.
Because
doesn't make any sense.
And a straight guy doesn't want to screw every woman that he sees. You know, so yeah, red-pilled lesbians are a thing, and It's partly because of the way feminist lesbians behave.
Yeah, actually, that first site that I was on, that I ever, where I stumbled across the manosphere, it was called the Spearhead. It's gone now, disappeared, but it was way more hardcore than A Voice for Men. And one of their favorite writers was a lesbian woman. And she was just like, I am a lesbian misogynist because women are awful. The women around me are awful. The women that I have the opportunity to have sex with are awful.
That's the rough thing. That I think both men and women, if you think your own sex is awful, you're hanging out with the wrong people. If you think the opposite sex is awful, you're hanging out with the wrong people. I think men and women, adult men and women who have grown up and become mature adult human beings and live as adults and they adult properly are wonderful. Both sexes have really wonderful things about them. There are men and women in my life that I admire more than I can even describe to you. And there are men and women who are awful. There are men and women who are adult children, and they deserve to be called adult children, and they deserve to be treated like adult children, and they are not representative of their gender.
Well, I think
exactly.
I think that what she was getting at is that, because when you're a lesbian, you have a fairly limited pool of
dating pool,
people, people to choose from, and many of those people are going to be more politically activated than the typical straight person, or more likely to be politically activated than the typical straight person, more likely to have a chip on their shoulder, incidentally, more likely to have been abused in a previous relationship than a straight woman. So essentially you're looking at this limited pool of people who are they just have a higher likelihood of having issues. Is I think
there's also the difference between women and men in terms of fighting, like. And again, this is partly because of the difference between the neighborhood I grew up in and other neighborhoods in my town that I understand this. And my hometown versus other hometowns, because I have actually won fights by just having somebody tell the person trying to start a fight with me what town I grew up in, and then they go away, up in that area. Or at least that was the way it was when I lived up there and I was younger. In any case, girls are not accustomed to, they don't grow up accustomed to the idea that if they hit somebody, nobody is going to stop that person from hitting them back. Right? And if they hit somebody who is bigger and stronger and faster and smarter than them, nobody is going to stop that person or feel sorry for them when that person kicks their ass. They're going to say, well, what did you start shit with that person for? That was dumb. Right?
Yeah,
that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen as consistently to girls as it does to boys. And so
we saw
boys,
we saw that with Casey the Giant. You remember that?
No.
You don't remember that viral video of that Australian boy? He was like,
yes, okay. I just didn't know his name was Casey the Giant. Yeah.
Overweight boy who was being just bullied.
Yeah.
Kid, and then he finally just picked him up and threw him down on the ground.
One hit. Well, 2 hits. Him hitting the bully and the bully hitting the ground.
Yeah, well, he didn't even hit the bully. He just picked him up.
Right.
Picked him up and threw him down. And it was just it just went viral, and
everybody was like, yeah!
The whole community was like, yes, that little scrawny fucker deserved it.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is a lesson that boys learn growing up. Girls don't. For the most part, girls don't. And so when they grow up, if they grow up in a neighborhood where they're the bully that does girls learn not to be physically demonstrative growing up because it's not ladylike. But every so often there's one girl in the entire crowd that doesn't. Yeah. And she is able to dominate all the other girls physically because they won't hit her back. And that girl is going to be, if she's a lesbian, if she's and a lot of times the more violent one is actually not the butch in a group. If there's a couple that has a butch and a femme, which isn't always the case, but she's able to dominate everyone around her because nobody hits her back. Well, if she gets into a relationship with another girl who has that same lack of control over her violence, then they're just going to beat on each other throughout their entire relationship. and nobody's going to stop them. Because who wants to get into... Nobody is dumb enough, very few people anyway, are dumb enough to get in the middle of a chick fight. You just don't do that.
Yeah, even my dad didn't do that when the butch, physically demonstrative bully, female bully, decided to target my sister.
That's what fire hoses are for.
Well, no, it was like literally here's what happened, right? My sister was targeted by this girl, right? Tormented by her for months. And then finally it was like, yeah, you're going to meet me here at this time and we're going to have it out. And my sister went and told my dad about what was happening. And she finally came and like essentially told my parents what was going on. And my dad said, okay, well, I'll drive you to the fight.
Yeah.
And then he drove her to the fight, and he held the guys back. Because there were guys who were trying to get, teenage boys who were trying
to white knight.
Trying to white knight, and he was like, no, you just let them have it out. And then my sister got pummeled pretty good, and then my dad took her out for ice cream and gave her a cigarette, and they hung out together and discussed it. And then after that, everything was all done. It was all done.
Yeah.
The whole situation was over, and my sister didn't have any more problems with that girl.
Because the fight was over.
Yeah, it was very strange. Because she showed up.
Yeah, once in a while, you run into a girl that's like that. On the side of town I grew up on, that's the way it was for the most part. I mean, there were girls that had lifelong feuds too. And it was dumb, like really dumb feuds. This person got on that side of the sandbox at the wrong time, and that was when it was the side for this particular game that was being played, and you invaded it. So now you're persona non grata until you're 50, because that's the way girls are. But there were girls in my neighborhood there was one girl that was really quiet, right? Nobody messed with her, and she didn't mess with anybody. She was just a really nice girl. And she'd hang out with your group, and occasionally you'd hear her say something in the midst of everybody else's joking around and stuff, and it would be just like anybody else would say, normal stuff. And for some reason, one day, one of the gals decided she wanted to fight her. And this girl, no, I don't want to fight. I don't get into fights. Leave me alone. And it was like, it went on like that for a whole couple of days, like, oh, we're gonna fight. You better agree to this, or you're a wimp. Okay, call me a wimp. I don't care. It doesn't make me one. And it went on like that until finally this girl realized that her challenger was just gonna keep getting on her nerves until she fought her. So her challenger comes up to her, and she's like, I'm not gonna let you out of this. You're gonna fight me. She goes, okay. And she knocked her out with one punch. And nobody challenged her after that. And they got along great. So, and that was, people figured out that was why she didn't get into fights too. She didn't want to do that to anybody. And that was kind of the end of the fight. So, yeah, that's, but we're like way off the patriarchy thing here. But yeah, and she was, so far as I know, I don't think she was a lesbian. She dated guys, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything in small town USA in the 80s. It might have been what you do to cover, but yeah, don't piss off the girl that repeatedly tells you she doesn't want to fight you, because she might have a reason other than you're going to kick my ass, So then you have, let's see, it scrolled again, damn it. Where was I? Super chat. Red Pill Lesbians. Crawl Dragon gave us $5 and said, hey, you can't talk about the women's role. Women's role, that's fat shaming. Yeah. I have a couple of women's roles from going from a high activity job to a low activity job and then not exercising. So I feel appropriately fat shamed now. Syria de Flora gave us $5 and said, so far, Gillette stock has dropped by a couple of dollars and slowly recovering. The next few months are going to be interesting. Chris Stewart gave us $5 and said, these sorts of stories sicken me. Also, your stream is cutting out constantly. There's bad weather coming, but I don't know if it's hit us yet. I mean, I think it's not supposed to hit until Saturday, so I don't know what would be interfering with this stream, honestly.
The patriarchy.
Yeah, the patriarchy.
Of course.
I think it's more that Ohio just has shit internet. I don't know. Maybe I need a new computer. Give me money. I'm just kidding.
Could be YouTube too. Like my stream had cutting out issues too for a while there, and it was.
Watch us be getting throttled. Who knows?
Oh God.
Yeah. Crawl Dragon gave us $2 and said, "We love you guys too. Heart. No hetero."
Extra homo.
Extra homo. That sounds like something you put on ice cream. Like, I'll have 3 scoops, extra homo. But I think we have completely decimated the topic at this point. We have talked about the topic and everything else that comes to mind. And we've been...
We talked about the topic, around the topic, adjacent to the topic, tangent.
The sausage is 2.5 hours plus. So almost 3 hours plus. So we are going to end the stream. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank my co-hosts for being here, being part of the stream. And thanks again to everybody in the background that makes HBR Talk happen. And last but not least, don't forget to like and share. So, smash that like button and share the stream everywhere you possibly can. Thanks all. Good night.